By the end of this video, you will know exactly how to speak Spanish in the past tense using the preterite and imperfect, starting with the preterite. If you're going to remember one thing from this video, let it be this. The preterite is used for one-time actions in the past. The imperfect is used for ongoing actions in the past. For example, yo hablé versus yo hablaba. So, yo hablé is preterite and it would mean I spoke, right? I wasn't speaking, I didn't used to speak, I spoke. The imperfect is for ongoing actions in the past, so that would mean something like I used to speak, or I was speaking, or I would speak. So taking a look at a preterite, this is how we are going to conjugate regular verbs into the preterite tense. In order to conjugate verbs in Spanish, you simply need to cut off either the AR, ER, or IR ending, and then add the new ending according to the rule. So for example, if we were to conjugate the verb hablar into the preterite tense, we would have yo hablé, tú hablaste, él, ella, usted habló, nosotros hablamos, ellos, ellas, ustedes hablaron. Vosotros is only used in Spain, and I will not cover it in this video. Now, the awesome thing about learning Spanish grammar is that once you memorize a table like this, you will be able to easily conjugate any new regular verb that you learn. This is going to save you hours upon hours of your time, so you don't have to memorize a ton of different words. Now, when it comes to the preterite, it is very important that you are careful with the accents. So if I were to say to you, mandó una carta, that is different than saying mando una carta. I like to teach my students that when there is an accent on a word, that they can kind of jump when they say it. So, for example, mandó una carta, not mando una carta. It's also worth noting that in the present and past nosotros form, the ending is exactly the same. For example, siempre cocinamos los sábados versus ayer cocinamos. Notice how the word cocinamos is actually the same in both the present and past tense. We tell the difference between the two using context clues. In the first example, we use the word siempre, meaning always. Therefore, we wouldn't be able to use this in the past tense just one time. And because we're using the word ayer in the second example, we know that this will be preterite. Ayer cocinamos. Yesterday, we cooked. Now, we do have various irregular verbs in the preterite tense, and here are some of the most common ones that we use. Ser, ir, dar, and ver. Notice that ser and ir are exactly the same in the preterite tense. My advice to you is don't worry too much about using ser in the preterite tense. The most common example of when we will use ser in the preterite tense is when we are saying that something was something. What I mean is, let's say we were to say, la fiesta fue divertida. The party was fun. However, it's not very common to see something like yo fui when talking about ser. So if you hear something like fui or fuiste, it's likely coming from the verb ir, meaning to go. So remember, the preterite is used for one-time actions in the past. Here are various examples for you. Compré un carro nuevo. Ella nació en México. Empezó a llover. Now, an important thing to understand when using the preterite is that we use it for specific times. For example, in 2019, I studied abroad in Spain for 3 months. So I could say something like, yo viví en España por 3 meses. That's a specific time, 3 meses, and therefore we will use the preterite. However, if I were to get rid of the specific time trigger, in this case, 3 meses, I could use the imperfect. So, for example, yo vivía en España. In this case, there is no specific time, so I can use the imperfect. Other examples of specific times with the preterite could be volví anoche a las ocho. Or, leí este libro el mes pasado. And it's also very common to use the preterite when talking about sequences. For example, me levanté, me vestí, y salí para la fiesta. If you'd like to learn Spanish faster, click the link in the video description or go to SpanishWithNate.com to join our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. Our goal is to help you have a 10-minute conversation in 90 days without feeling unconfident. We have more than 750 students getting results in the real world. Every week, we have live conversation classes with a native Mexican teacher. We provide worksheets, exercises, flashcards, and we have an amazing online community. Check it out by clicking the link in the video description or by going to SpanishWithNate.com. Now let's take a look at the imperfect. Remember, the imperfect is used for ongoing actions in the past, whereas the preterite is used for one-time actions in the past. This is how we can conjugate verbs into the imperfect tense. Once again, we will take off either the AR, ER, or IR ending and add the new ending according to our rule. So using an AR verb like hablar, we can say yo hablaba, tú hablabas, él, ella, usted hablaba, nosotros hablábamos, ellos, ellas, ustedes hablaban. And for an ER verb, we could say something like yo comía, tú comías, él, ella, usted comía, nosotros comíamos, ellos, ellas, ustedes comían. And I have some really good news for you. There are only 3 irregular verbs in the imperfect tense. Ir, ser, and ver, which I don't really count ver. So really it's just ser and ir. Here are the 3 imperfect conjugations for these irregular verbs. Feel free to take a photo. Now let's take a look at some examples. Comíamos juntos todos los días. Now, you could translate comíamos into we used to eat, we were eating, or we would eat. However, in the context of this sentence, it would make most sense to use a translation of used to or would. A quick pro tip is be careful with the translation of would when using the imperfect tense. That's because we also have what is called the conditional tense, which is I would do this, but I'm busy, or I would go there, but I don't have money. That is different from the imperfect tense. So my advice to you is that instead of using the translation of would, which while it may work, it's better to use the idea of used to, or you were doing something. Another example could be ellos iban de compras todo el tiempo. So in this case, iban could translate to would go. However, careful, it might be better to use used to go in this case. Remember, the imperfect is used for actions that were ongoing in the past. So, for example, iba a clase cuando sonó mi teléfono. So in this case, I was going to class, but then it gets interrupted by the preterite. Sonó el teléfono. The phone was not ringing, it rang. That's the preterite. It's a one-time action in the past. Another example could be mi mamá cocinaba cuando regresé a casa. Once again, we are using the imperfect cocinaba and the preterite regresé. Now, you might also be familiar with the past progressive tense, which is this idea of an ongoing action in the past. In this example, you could also use it. So instead of saying mi mamá cocinaba cuando regresé a casa, you could say mi mamá estaba cocinando cuando regresé a casa. Is there a difference between the two? The answer is yes and no. Mi mamá cocinaba in this context would be was cooking. However, if we were to use cocinaba in a different context, it could potentially take on the translation of used to cook or would cook. However, when we say something like estaba cocinando, there is no room for guessing. It is what it is. Was cooking is the only translation that we can use there. So cocinaba would be slightly less specific, whereas estaba cocinando would be more specific. We'll also use the imperfect when talking about times, dates, and age. For example, eran las 2 de la mañana. Or eran las 5 de la tarde. And for age, we could say something like yo tenía 4 años. Now you might argue, yeah, but Nate, couldn't I say yo tuve 4 años? I mean, it's over, so couldn't we use the preterite? And the answer is, in this case, the Spaniards have decided that we're going to use the imperfect when talking about age, because I was 4 years old for however long, and then yes, eventually it did end. My advice is that when you are unsure if you should use the preterite or the imperfect, default to the imperfect. So while you might be incorrect in certain situations, if you're not sure and you're having a conversation with someone, instead of getting stuck and freezing up and having the conversation continue without you, just default to the imperfect. So if you're not sure if you should say estuvo or estaba, use estaba. If you're not sure if you should use something like fui versus era, use era. Now, of course, this is not always going to be correct, but many times it is. So if you're not sure, default to the imperfect instead of the preterite. And finally, we will use the imperfect to describe characteristics and feelings. Once again, remember, the imperfect is for simply things that are ongoing in the past. For example, mi maestro era alto y guapo. Me sentía feliz con mi trabajo nuevo. And finally, I want to show you some important phrases that would trigger the use of the preterite or the imperfect. These are some very common triggers for the preterite. Una vez. Ayer. El otro día. Entonces. Anoche. Esta noche. Esta mañana. La semana pasada. El mes pasado. Now, here are some common triggers for the imperfect. A veces. Siempre. Mientras. Todos los días. Cada día. Nunca. Mucho. Todo el tiempo. Gracias. I think you'll like this video. Click here to watch it now.